Hello and welcome back to another season of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. We're very excited to present our 5th season this year, and we have a great set of speakers lined up. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. We have over 145 episodes recorded and available on YouTube, so if you miss out because of load shedding or your Tuesday nights have become busy, never fear, you can always catch up later. Tonight, the webinar is about the bird of the year for 2024, the Bateleur, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Rick Watson to the show. Rick Watson was born in Joburg, but moved to the UK at 4 years old, where he developed a passion for the sea and sailing, and that led him to do a bachelor's degree in marine zoology, which later morphed into a passion for conservation of biodiversity wherever it was needed. He returned to South Africa with his wife in 1981 and was working in Kruger for his PhD on the ecology of the Bateleur. They immigrated to the US in 1988, where Rick was hired by the Peregrine Fund to find the Madagascar serpent eagle and the red owl, neither of which were recorded in the previous 6 decades and were potentially extinct. He then moved with his family to Madagascar to live for 6 months, starting up a project there. And after that, Rick managed others in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Ivory Coast, Cape Verde, and Ethiopia, and also in Asia and Latin America. He became the Peregrine Fund's vice president in 2007 and president in 2017, prioritizing raptor conservation and research worldwide until he retired in 2022. I was about to say last year, but that's now no longer true. So Rick, we are very privileged to have you on the show to tell us all about Bateleurs and raptor conservation that you've been doing over the years. So you can turn on your video so everyone can see you and unmute, and then we can start sharing your screen.
Okay, hi. Well, good evening, everybody. And thank you for inviting me to talk about Bateleurs and raptor conservation around the world. I'll start with the Bateleur because my study of the species, now 40 years ago, I might add, in the early 1980s, set the stage for my career in raptor conservation worldwide. Let's see. Okay, my computer's taking a little while to wake up here. So as you know, I'm sure, the Bateleur has got to be the most colorful eagle in Africa, with its bright red face and black body and bright red legs and a rufous colored back and tail and black and white underwings. So the early 1980s, while I was doing my PhD at Wits University, were really my formative years in raptor conservation. My task was to study the Bateleur and figure out why it might be endangered. And of course, my study revolved around studying the ecology of the species, which is studying the distribution and the abundance of the species and what factors affected those distribution and abundance. Once you understand the ecology of a species, then you can begin to design conservation actions. So the Bateleur is very distinctive in the sky, has long, thin wings. The pattern on the underside has a black stripe on the trailing edge of the wing. In the male, it's a broad black stripe, and in the female, shown on the left here, it's a narrow black stripe. And actually, if you see these birds through a spotting scope, kilometers away, you can tell, first of all, that they're Bateleurs by the profile and the way they're flying, but you can actually tell the sex of the bird, whether it's male or female, as well. Now, Bateleurs have some really interesting behaviors. For example, down in the bottom right hand of the screen, we've got a pair of Bateleurs, a male and female, allopreening. That is, they're preening each other as part of their courtship display. In the bottom left, we've got a Bateleur, I think it's a male, sunning itself with its wings outspread like a phoenix of Egyptian mythology. They love to stand in water for hours at a time, typically on a hot afternoon. After they've finished foraging, they'll go and find a puddle or stream to stand in, and they'll just cool their feet. Bateleurs have a number of different age classes, non-adult age classes, that is, actually 5 different age classes, from nestling, shown here in the top middle, to the juvenile straight out of the nest, then an immature age class that you can distinguish based on plumage, and then a subadult age class based on plumage, and a pre-adult age class. So it takes about 5 years for them to reach maturity, and you can actually distinguish their age at each of those stages, which is a really handy feature for understanding the population ecology of the species. Well, my study began by looking at their nesting ecology. From that, by finding nests, adjacent nests and territories, I could understand what the density of the species was in the landscape. I could measure various parameters around the nest site and understand site selection. And of course, by tracking their breeding biology, I could understand their productivity, their breeding productivity on an annual basis. Interestingly, bateleurs only lay 1 egg, which is much more like the natural history of a much larger eagle or even a condor that only lays 1 egg. They have a really long incubation period, about 55 days, and the nestling period is at least 90 days. And the nests are very typical in the sense that they're either high in a well-foliated tree or in a thorn tree, which is really difficult to get into. They prioritize being cryptic and hiding away from potential predators. I don't know if you noticed this earlier on, but I've just highlighted the nestling in this nest. Very difficult to see, and that's deliberate. So from nesting ecology, you can also collect prey remains from the nest. And I did that. I actually collected more than 4,000 prey remains from bateleur nests and analyzed exactly what they were eating. And it turns out they eat an awful lot of different kinds of things because they pick them up dead. They're scavengers. In the bottom left-hand photo here, we've got a 30-centimeter rure in the middle of that picture, just to show you size. But there's a barbel skull, a fish skull, on the left-hand side of that ruler. There's various jaws from small antelope. There's a leg and hoof from some small antelope, and a backbone and pelvis from an antelope. There's even a warthog tusk in the bottom left of that picture. So you can see they have a very broad diet, and it's all largely picked up as dead animals. I also studied the home range of the species. So early on, we tried to capture some of these birds. We spent actually about 6 months trying to capture a bateleur. We caught only one, shown here in the arms of my wife, Christine. It turns out they're really, really difficult to capture. And so I had to give up on the idea of putting radio telemetry on these birds to track them, and instead go back to the conventional way of observing birds. That's to get up high. I built a scaffold on the top of a rocky outcrop here. I also used the top of small rocky outcrops to sit on and use a spotting scope to track the birds as they flew around their territory. And actually, it's a far more satisfactory way of observing an animal than remote telemetry, because you see exactly what they're doing and where they're going, and and you're able to interpret any interactions they have with other birds, such as 2 males getting together and displaying at each other is a form of territoriality. A male and a female getting together and displaying was typically courtship. And of course, you can see their foraging behavior, which is, of course, what they do most of the time. They typically fly over about 2 or 3 times treetop level. They soar, they glide, rather like, forgetting the name of them, bird. Anyway, they soar a lot. And they travel over large areas, about a 50 square kilometer home range, in which they are looking for small dead animals to pick up. The bateleur in the middle here is a male, of course, and you can just see that it's got a snake in its bill as it's flying along. Now, the other main part of what I did to understand the distribution of the species and their abundance in Kruger National Park was to do road count surveys, starting from Punta Maria in the northern part of Kruger National Park. Every 3 months, I would do a very standardized road count, traveling at exactly the same speed, pickup vehicle, bucky, and counting bateleurs along the road as I went, recording their distance from the road, and from that I was able to work out their density in the landscape. So from that I was able to see the distribution of the species, their abundance in Kruger National Park. I was able to understand the habitat selection, and I was also able to understand the age class composition of the population based on those 5 different non-adult age classes and the adult individuals. And from all of that, I was able to, because I did this every 3 months for a 2-year period, I was able to understand the seasonal variations of all of these above. What was really interesting was that Bateleur adult population stayed really very stable over that entire period. The density was pretty much identical from one road count survey to the next, but the abundance of non-adult birds varied on a seasonal basis. At the end of every breeding season, of course, the nestlings came out of the nests, and so the first age class, the juvenile age class, became much more abundant. As the breeding season, the following breeding season began, several months later, both the juveniles and the other non-adult age classes would become much less abundant in the Kruger National Park. And that's because the adults became quite territorial, quite aggressive in their territories, and they would literally drive out all the juvenile age classes, including their own young, from their territory, so that they could begin their breeding season for the next season. What's interesting is that the other age classes, the older age classes, the 2, 3, 4, and 5-year-old birds, also were driven out of the park at that time, at the beginning of the breeding season, but they would drift back in again at the end of the following breeding season and in between breeding seasons. So you got this constant influx and outflux of young birds in and out of Kruger Park, which leaves them vulnerable to what I then discovered as being the main problem for the species. By doing bait trials, I mimicked what ranchers would do in predator control situations outside of the park. They would put a pellet of strychnine or some other poison into baits and drop them along their farm roads to kill problem livestock predators. What I did was the same thing, except I didn't put any poison in the baits. I simply dropped meat baits along fire breaks and roads in Kruger Park, and then I sat in my vehicle several meters away, hundreds of meters away actually, and observed the bait with a spotting scope to see what was the first animal to find them. Because of course the first animal would be the one to get poisoned by the ranchers outside of the park. And incredibly, bateleurs were the first animal there during daylight hours, of course. I was only doing this while bateleurs might be foraging, 92% of the time. So they found the baits first, 92% of the time, which means that they're incredibly vulnerable to poisoning by this method of predator control. In fact, ranchers using this form of predator control probably have wiped out bateleurs before they actually kill anything else. Well, this was the main finding of my my thesis back in the mid-1980s. By this stage, of course, because juvenile birds or non-adult birds move in and out of the park, they become vulnerable to this kind of poisoning as well. And so my fear was that while the adults inside the park were protected, the juveniles which move in and out of the park may well be very vulnerable to poisoning. Well, that was the end of my PhD study that was published, and the information was made publicly available. And it was up to other conservation organizations like BirdLife South Africa and Endangered Wildlife Trust and so on to go out and do the conservation work that was needed to preserve the species. Of course, working in Kruger National Park is always interesting, with lots of close-up encounters with other animals, including elephants seen through the side of my vehicle window, and lions and a whole bunch of other things on which depend upon the large protected area of the national park. And my study really highlighted how valuable large protected areas are in terms of conservation of endangered species like the Bateleur and many other birds of prey in Africa. So large protected areas are critically important. Well, from studying the Bateleur in the early 1980s, I was hired by an organization called the Peregrine Fund in 1990. It's a US-based organization created to save the peregrine falcon from extinction. It was started back in 1970 at Cornell University. And to make a really long story short, they saved the peregrine falcon from extinction by breeding them in captivity and releasing them back into the wild, so that by the mid-1990s, the species was taken off the US endangered species list. My first task of working for the Peregrine Fund was to go to Madagascar, which of course you all know for its cuddly, cute lemurs, and find several species of birds of prey that were considered to be potentially extinct. Even the Madagascar serpent eagle, the Madagascar red owl had not been seen in 6 decades and were therefore technically considered to be extinct, but we believe that they might still exist. And the Madagascar fish eagle, it's endemic to the island of Madagascar, was known to be critically endangered, and nobody really knew what to do about it. Well, it took us several years to find the Madagascar red owl. Here it is. It's actually a barn owl species, but it's red, and it's this beautiful brown color, red color. And it's found only in the rainforests of Madagascar. It took us several years to find that species. And then just a few months later, so also several years of effort and searching, we rediscovered the Madagascar serpent eagle, also in the rainforest of Madagascar. We've now been working in Madagascar for 34 years. So it's a really long-term project that the Peregrine Fund has been doing. And those 2 species were discovered on Mashwal Peninsula in the top northeast corner of the island of Madagascar. So one of our first tasks was to help the government of Madagascar turn Mashwal into a national park. It took us several years to do that, and it protected over 500,000 acres of pristine rainforest on the peninsula. It's a totally roadless area. It's mountainous. It's difficult to get through, really hard to find animals like the serpent eagle and red owl in there, but we did that and helped turn it into a national park. Subsequently, several 100,000 acres have been turned into a marine reserve around the park. So in total, it protects over 1 million acres of habitat. Now, we also worked in 2 other areas, Bemenivka area up in the northern part of Madagascar, and the Manambulu Lakes complex in the western part of Madagascar. And we've helped protect those areas as well through what we call community-based conservation projects. And we worked in the western side of Madagascar to try and understand the ecology of the Madagascar fish eagle. Like the African fish eagle, it has a white tail, it's brown, but its head is quite different. It's just got this little white cheek patch on the head, and not the full white head of the African fish eagle. We studied the ecology of this species to understand why it might be limited in its distribution and abundance, and we did surveys to find out what its distribution and abundance was. In fact, there are only about 100 breeding pairs of the species left. That's a really small population size found just along the western seaboard of Madagascar. They have some really unusual behaviors, like having quite often, not always, but quite often, 3 adult birds at the nest, typically 2 males and 1 female, with the dominant male that maintains the territory. And it turns out, based on genetics, the subordinate male is quite often the father of the young in the nest, rather unexpectedly. They also lay typically 2 eggs, but they only ever raise 1 young due to this phenomenon known as siblicide, in which the first chick to hatch is typically larger than the second chick to hatch and kills the second chick. So the larger, stronger chick will kill the second one. It's a phenomenon known that's not uncommon in many eagle species. We also learned that local people, in this particular case, that the stronghold of the species around that Manambulamati Lakes complex, have 2 rather undesirable behaviors. One is that they will wait until the chick is fairly large in the nest, and then they'll climb the tree and steal the chick and eat it. This is the remains of a roasted Madagascar fish eagle that we discovered on the right-hand photograph. The other thing they do is they have these superstitions where they can cast a spell on a neighbor they don't like, or whatever. But as part of that, to make the spell stronger, they will capture a fish eagle and remove 1 foot. They'll then wear this foot as a talisman to increase the strength of whatever spell they've cast. And of course, most of those birds that lose a foot, they'll release it again, because apparently it only works if the bird remains alive. So they'll release a bird with missing 1 foot. And of course, most of those die because they can't survive with just 1 foot. This particular individual held here in the photo on the left is an exception to that rule. It actually lived quite a number of years with just 1 foot, and even survived well enough to breed with just 1 foot. But like I say, we found more dead eagles missing a foot than we ever found alive. So this is a really problematic. It means that for this critically endangered species, there's a human element of mortality that we thought we should try and deal with. Oops, going the wrong way. There we go. So fairly early on, by 1993, we began working with the local fishing population. And it turned out they had a problem that they needed to address that we could help them with. They were being overrun by migrant fishermen from other parts of Madagascar. So we worked with them to develop a community-based conservation project in which they used their own traditional rules that were backed up by the local police, who we helped to get into the area as a very remote location. We worked with the Topendrano, the keeper of the lakes, who by tradition controlled when the fishing season would occur and what size fishing nets they would use and so on. We simply worked to enforce his rules. And in return for that, the community developed a system of both reforestation around the edges of the lake, because of course they would cut the tallest trees closest to the edge of the lake to build their dugout canoes, which meant that the forest on the edge of the lake was being deforested. So we helped them establish a reforestation program around the lakes. And then they also instituted a system of permits so that they could control those migrant fishermen from overfishing their lakes. And in return for that, they agreed to essentially leave Madagascar fish eagles alone. It was a real partnership which benefited both the fish eagles and the local communities. We then went on and developed community-based conservation projects which involved development of the local communities. They were an incredibly poor community. They lived days away from any kind of roads or communications, and we helped them bridge those gaps. So in addition to the reforestation program We help them with an invasive plant eradication on their lakes, which of course then improved their fisheries. We also help them by supporting and training scouts for control and surveillance of the forests around the lakes and the fishing system on the lakes. We help them build a fire break to protect their forest. We help them with educational support, both in terms of supplies and teachers, agricultural support so that they could develop new forms of agriculture in addition to their traditional fisheries. We provided them with seeds so they could grow crops that they'd never been able to do before. And we helped their fishery system. We actually introduced the use of fiberglass canoes rather than those wooden dugout canoes, which would typically rot in a year or two. Fiberglass canoes have a lifespan of 10+ years. And we helped them develop a system for gaining a small amount of income from each fiberglass canoe that was used so that they could continue to replace and repair those canoes over time. Now, remember, this all took more than 30 years, so we've been at this for several decades. We also helped improve the quality of their life through well construction. We even built a small central hydroelectricity system so that they had electricity for the first time ever. And we've helped them find alternative sources or additional sources of income, including beekeeping, the use of propagation of domestic ducks, fruit trees, and help them develop women's associations, which introduced additional sources of revenue to the community. And in one of our project sites, we developed a small ecotourism system at the Bateleur site up in northern Madagascar, which brought tourists in to see the Madagascar serpent eagle and Madagascar red owl and other species that were found only in that location. So over a 34-year period, this project developed or trained more than 30 technicians. We had 24 Malagasy students receive their master's degree, 3 doctoral degrees, 4 engineers, and between them, those individuals published more than 240 scientific papers on the studies they did on the raptors and other species of Madagascar. And we developed 15 local community-based associations, 15 local associations that protected those areas in which we worked. But I think our greatest achievement really was the development of Malagasy individuals. In the top right-hand corner here is my colleague, Dr. Lily Arisson René de Roland. He was my first student in Madagascar in the early 1990s, 1992. He went on and got both his master's degree and PhD and a professorship in Madagascar, and then joined the Peregrine Fund as the program director in 2000. So he's actually run this project for the last 15 years. And he is responsible for discovering or rediscovering the Madagascar pochard, shown in the bottom left here, a species which had literally just been declared extinct in Madagascar. Lily, on one of his very remote searches for birds of prey, actually, discovered this species on some lakes up in northern Madagascar, which then became our third project site, the Bateleur area. Lily, in addition to that, has discovered 4 new lemur species, a new gecko species, and a variety of other things as well. So a pretty incredible field biologist as well as project manager. And this is all despite really some of the challenges of working in Madagascar. Many of the places that we worked were roadless areas, which is very challenging. We would resort to local transportation, ox carts and dugout canoes whenever things went wrong, such as when the occasion on which the captain of the local ferry let his ferry run dry during the dry season of that year. It was stuck on the banks of the river for the following 6 months until the rains came and flooded the river, and he was able to refloat his ferry again. And actually, that happened more than once. So Madagascar is a great example of community-based conservation and a huge amount of effort and a long-term investment by the Peregrine Fund in conservation. The next project I'm going to talk about are crashing populations, cause unknown, of vultures in South Asia. 3 species of gyps vultures, populations crashed from about 1990, when there were literally millions of vultures across South Asia, to 2000, so in the space of just a decade, they became critically endangered. They were listed as critically endangered because they were dying at a phenomenal rate, literally dropping out of trees dead at your feet. We became involved in 2000 to try and figure out what on earth was going on. We worked in Pakistan for about 4 years to understand what was causing this huge fatality rate amongst vultures. And we worked typically with the oriental white-backed vulture, Gyps bengalensis. In that period, we collected over 1,700 dead vultures, and we measured their mortality rate at over 30% per year, which is not a sustainable rate of population of mortality in any species. We did almost 500 gross post-mortems of freshly dead vultures, and 97% of them, so the vast majority, had died of kidney failure, shown as gout, or this white pasty deposit on the internal body organs of the birds. And our control birds in the experiment, well, it wasn't an experiment, our control birds were the remaining 3%, which had died of a variety of other causes, such as being hit by cars, colliding with power lines, and so on. So kidney failure was the primary cause of mortality of these birds, and we needed to figure out why. We spent 2 years looking for the typical usual suspects of kidney failure in birds. We tested a new disease theory and found nothing. So it took us 2 years to eliminate all the usual suspects and this new disease theory of mortality in these vultures. So by 2002, we realized we were looking for something completely new to science, never heard of before. So we did a survey amongst the veterinarians and pharmacists and livestock owners in Pakistan, simply asking them what chemicals and drugs they used on their livestock. And it turned out that the survey revealed that diclofenac was widely used. It was fairly new to the market, so its introduction to the market coincided with this huge mortality rate. It could be orally ingested, and it's a potential cause of kidney failure in birds. Diclofenac was being used in the veterinary market to allay the pain and discomfort of sick animals. It's a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, which simply controls inflammation and pain. It's not of any curative value, it's palliative value. So we went back and looked at all our tissue samples, and there was in 100% of the gout death birds and in 0% of the control death birds. So we had discovered the cause of the mortality. We then went on to prove this experimentally and published the results in the journal Nature by early 2004. At that same time, literally the same week that it came out in publication, we held a summit meeting with the governments of India, Pakistan, and Nepal to present our results and other individuals' results of mathematical modeling of how this rather unusual course of mortality could have caused the population crash that we'd observed. And we made recommendations to ban the veterinary use of this drug as quickly as possible. It took the governments of India, Pakistan, and Nepal about 2 years to actually put that into effect, which at the time seemed incredibly long, but it was actually really pretty quick compared to many other countries getting anything done. So it was banned in 2006, and it really effectively stopped the population crash of those species almost immediately. And then other species, other organizations took the job of restoring those species under their wing and are continuing that work to this day. And then my third example of raptor conservation around the world isn't it rather an unusual cause of population decline in the ridge-waist hawk, a critically endangered species found in the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, actually primarily found in the country of Dominican Republic, Haiti being the other country that occupies the island of Hispaniola. And we discovered a fatal botfly infestation causing breeding failure. These flies would lay their eggs on nestlings. The larvae of these eggs of the botfly would burrow into the skin of the nestlings and literally eat them alive. So breeding failure was the primary cause of the decline of the species. We developed over several years a treatment using permethrin and literally going into the nests and treating these nestlings with permethrin and the nests surrounding the nestlings to kill the botflies before they had a chance to lay their eggs. And this treatment increased the breeding productivity of the species by 180% and really saved the species from extinction. But in addition to that, the species was limited to such a tiny little area, which has made them vulnerable to catastrophic events like fire and hurricanes and so on. We determined that we needed to spread the species around back to its former range and began a program of repopulation of ridge-waist hawks, starting at a tourist resort called Punta Cana in Dominican Republic, where we built the first new population of the species from young saved from the original national park population not far away. Again, critically important to all our projects is developing local capacity so that these individuals, Dominicans and Haitians, could continue this project long after the Peregrine Fund has moved on. And with their help, this species is well onto recovery. And my final example is closer to my home here in northern Idaho, actually in Arizona and Utah, which really aren't very far away. We've worked with California condors, which are poisoned by lead. How on earth do they get poisoned by lead? Well, it turns out it comes from the fragments of shattered bullets left in animal remains. So when a hunter uses a lead-based bullet to shoot a deer or elk or some other animal like a varmint, they call the coyotes, and they leave the remains of that animal in the field, there's enough lead fragments in that carcass to kill a condor that might feed upon the remains of the animal. Having discovered this, we know that condors will recover. They actually were extinct in the wild. The last individuals were taken out of the wild in the 1980s to start a captive breeding program. They've now been reintroduced back into the wild. There's now about 500 condors in existence. About half of them are back in the wild. We know they'll recover, but only once lead is removed from their food chain. So our conservation efforts are both recovery of the species. We breed them in captivity and we release them back into the wild in Arizona, Utah. But also a major part of what we do is working with hunters and hunting organizations and conservation organizations across the country to persuade hunters to switch from lead-based bullets to solid copper bullets, which do not fragment and are not a problem for California condors and other scavengers. It's not just the condor that's affected, but it was the condor that almost went extinct as a result of this work, as a result of using lead-based bullets. It's an ongoing project. We've been at this now for 25 years, and we'll probably be at it for another 25 before the species is safe. Throughout all of my presentations this evening, I've stressed local capacity development, investing in local individuals in all of these projects so that they can continue the work that we start wherever we've started these conservation projects. And just for fun, I'm going to end up with this couple of slides. This is some photos of my children in Madagascar in 1995. Ben was 5 years old and Heather was 4 years old at the time. A tremendous adventure, but just to show the passage of time since we were in Madagascar, This is my children now. Ben on the right-hand side is a world traveler. He's an engineer. And my daughter Heather is a conservation biologist with a family of her own. And we now have 3 grandchildren living not far away from us here in Northern Idaho. And as for myself, as Christina mentioned earlier on, I retired a couple of years ago, and am eternally grateful for the many individuals that I worked with in all these different countries and places who very often had to take care of me. There's photos of this of me in Panama, having hiked for about 6 hours through the rainforest, and I was totally beat. Whereas my Panamanian colleague here on my right-hand side rescued me with a stick of sugarcane, put me under a shelter, and let me recover. This happened so many times, I can't tell you. But I am eternally grateful for all the local individuals who we've worked with, who we've helped to train and support to achieve conservation wherever there was a need. And with that, I'll end my presentation and turn it back to Christina.
Wow, that was an amazing presentation. Thanks very much, Rick. That was, wow, you've had an amazing career in some very interesting places. And I'm not that familiar with the work of the Peregrine Fund, so this was a great look at what's been done over the years. It seems like it's a great catalyst, and I really like the emphasis on the community development and the local development and capacity building. That's so key to making sure that these conservation interventions continue. So that's a great philosophy to have.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have a couple of questions, and I would just like to remind our audience that they can ask questions in the Q&A box. Please don't put them in the chat feed, as it's more difficult to keep track of them. But before we get to that, I just want to remind everyone that we'll be back again in 2 weeks' time, and we will be hosting a special World Wetlands Day webinar with my colleague, Dr. Kyle Lloyd, who will be talking about his work conserving wetlands and the elusive white-winged flufftail. So be sure to join us for that. So the first question, Rick, is from Joseph in Rwanda, and I'm actually going to answer it because he's asking how the Bateleur was chosen to be the bird of the year. So BirdLife South Africa accepts nominations for Bird of the Year from our members every year, and we like to choose one that we can build a good conservation message and educational message around, and usually one that's endangered or under threat in some way, so that we can educate. And we develop these amazing educational materials and lesson plans that we take to schools and help educate the younger generation. So it's chosen by a committee of made up of BirdLife South Africa staff, but we have criteria that each Bird of the Year needs to meet. So then we'll get on to some for you, Rick. Henny Visser says, you mentioned that the Bateleur is one of the most colorful eagles in the world. Which other eagle do you know of that has similar or more striking features? Would you say the Bateleur is the most, or only one of the most?
Well, I would say it may well be the most, although I meant the most colorful in Africa, which then precludes all the other species around the world. But I don't know. Arguably, I'd say it may be the most colorful in the sense that it has these bright red face, bright red legs, and so many different color patches on the body, black body and rufous back and tail, which, by the way, sometimes it can be a kind of cream colored back and tail. About 5% of the population actually has a cream color, and that's just a genetic variation in the species, a morphological variation. Other species, well, there's lots of charismatic eagle species. The harpy eagle in Latin America, for example, a very large eagle with its big crest. It's a gray and white species, so definitely not as varied color as the Bateleur, but very striking. Oh gosh, there's lots. Ornate hawk eagle, for example, is another very spectacular bird. There's lots of hawks that are quite colorful. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think one could debate it for quite a lot of time. And I think that I can just get away with saying that I think it's the most colorful eagle potentially in the world.
Great. So Glynis Kutsia asks, has anyone conducted follow-up studies for comparative purposes since 1986? So I assume she's talking about a follow-up on your PhD.
You know, as far as I know, no one's actually done that, which is really quite devastating. In fact, I would love for somebody to get out there and do the same kind of road counts, for example, that I did, because that would be the quickest way of determining what the population in Kruger Park is doing and how it compares with 40 years ago. I would do it, except it takes a bit of money and time and effort, and I live halfway around the world, so it's not exactly easy for me. I know that there was some interest in doing it probably about 10 or 15 years ago, but I don't think it's actually been accomplished. And so I would encourage anyone, but particularly perhaps another PhD or a master's degree student, to get out there and do the same kind of study that I did for comparison. It would be hugely valuable.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I don't think anyone is actually working on the Bateleur at the moment, which is quite a big gap. So hopefully someone will see this and be inspired.
Yep, I hope there's some young individual student out there listening to this who might take this under their wing, as it were. Yes,
absolutely. So Michelle Zuckerman asks about the vultures and the diclofenac kidney failure due to gout. Were uric acid crystals found in the kidney, and was there opportunity to measure uric acid in the blood? So
well, to be honest, I can't give you a good answer for that. I don't know. I don't know that we actually measured uric acid either in the kidney or the blood. Certainly the white deposit on the internal body organs, a sort of paste-like white deposit, was uric acid. And that was indicative of kidney failure. The diagnostic studies that were done, histopathology studies and microbiology studies and so on, were done by Lindsay Oakes from the Washington State University veterinary department. He's actually an avian virologist, and he did all of the diagnostic work for us, which was an interesting challenge because we had to get those tissue samples from Pakistan to Washington State University in North America in a form that could be analyzed for virtually anything, whether it was a genetic analysis for a new bacteria or virus, to looking for ultimately the chemical that caused the decline of the species diclofenac. That was a challenge, which would be an interesting story, but for another time, perhaps.
And now we jump to Madagascar, where Carol Weber asks if you know what the approximate size of the Madagascar fish eagle population is now.
I believe it's still around 120 breeding pairs, which you'll realize is a very small population, but it's spread over maybe 1,000 kilometers along the length of the coastline and up to about 100 kilometers inland on lakes and rivers inland. So they're very widely distributed, not a large population. As far as our surveys go, which are done once every 5 years now, they seem to be fairly stable, but they're very vulnerable. as you can imagine, with such a small
Yeah.
population.
Okay. Well, hopefully they'll the population will increase over the years as the conservation measures take hold. So we have a few more Bateleur questions. So Jeremy says Bateleurs also occurred in Saudi Arabia, and there's presently great impetus in developing large conservation areas. And I'm not quite sure, I don't quite understand this question, but is there any record of hacking back young Bateleurs to independence? I don't know if that's a term that you're aware of, hacking.
Yes, hacking is a term which is used for reintroducing raptors to the wild. It's a process for reintroducing raptors to the wild. We used hacking to reintroduce peregrine falcons that had been bred in captivity back into the wild in North America very successfully. We've used hacking to restore the aplomado falcon to the southern parts of the United States, and in a variety of other situations. We tried hacking Madagascar fish eagles, for example. Instead of allowing that older chick to kill the younger chick, we saved the younger chick first. We raised it up in captivity and tried hacking those birds back into the wild to increase the population size. Not so easy with a large eagle like that, particularly a fish eagle. I don't think anyone has tried hacking Bateleurs in terms of, reintroducing young to or captive bred individuals back to the wild. I think it would be quite difficult. It's a different kind of process for a scavenging bird than a really predaceous raptor that kills its prey live. It would be quite tricky. So I don't think it's been done. Doesn't mean it's to say it can't be done. We introduce scavenging condors, for example, through a similar kind of method. That's a much more gradual method. So I hope that answers your question. I don't think it's been done.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. I'm just looking through, there's quite a few questions still coming in. Caroline asks about the poison bait that you mentioned, and asking who was doing that and why were they doing it?
Well, typically ranchers will use a variety of methods to control problem predators. So if they have jackals, or here in the United States, coyotes attacking their livestock, or other predators, whether it's leopards or lions or hyenas or whatever, attacking their livestock, they will quite often resort quickly to using poison baits to kill the problem predator. And this was going on very predominantly in South Africa when I was doing my PhD study, and for the years before that. I assume that it still continues. I don't have any first-hand knowledge. I do know that conservation organizations in South Africa put a great deal of effort into developing and trying to persuade ranchers to use alternative ways of dealing with problem predators taking their livestock. I can't speak to you about how effective that's been, but maybe Christina, would you know?
I don't know about farmers and using poison, but I do know that there is a big problem with poachers poisoning the carcass that they've killed to prevent vultures from giving away the location of the carcass. So I would imagine that Bateleurs are also vulnerable to that. But I don't know about the use of poison in farming. I would imagine that there's still probably, unfortunately, places that do it, but hopefully that, there's not too many. Let's see what else we have here. Just going back to the hacking discussion, Jeremy says, packing of captive bred birds has been done very successfully with Eurasian griffins, Eurasian lammergeiers, and Egyptian vultures. So it seems to work with some scavenging species, but as you say, I don't think anyone's done it for bateleurs.
Right.
Marty, excuse me. Marty asks, other than perhaps redoing or updating your PhD, what would be the main missing piece of the puzzle for bateleurs that you think would be most important to focus on? Is it purely population counts, or is there something else that you think would be better to look at?
I think population counts, wherever they occur, would be a tremendously valuable way of monitoring what's happening to the population, to the species as a whole. I think it would be really interesting to understand where those juvenile birds go to when they're forced out of the territories that are maintained in, say, Kruger National Park or other areas where the species is present and breeding. There's some evidence that the birds from Kruger Park might actually head west towards what at that time was known as the Kalahari. Galagadi, I guess, is the current name. But there's really no hard evidence. So if you could figure out how to put telemetry on those birds, particularly satellite telemetry, and there's some really tiny little satellite transmitters, then that would be a really interesting thing to do, because that would tell you how vulnerable these young birds are to poisoning wherever it occurs. Gosh, beyond that, I mean, there's a huge amount of information that one could collect and understand better. Some of their behaviors, I didn't really understand, or rather, I didn't really study their behaviors in a great deal of detail, but they certainly have some of the most incredible displays, both in the air and on perches, on trees, which would be really interesting to understand much better. I would encourage anybody who's interested to take a look at the publications that I have, take a look at my thesis, which I can send you as a PDF, and develop a project on your own.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there's many questions that still need to be answered. Someone actually must have been Googling as you were speaking and posted a link to your PhD in the chat. So hopefully people can find that if they want to. And I forgot to ask someone, Jeremy, I think, asked whether you'd be happy for me to share your email address in the chat box. So if anyone is interested to find out more, would you mind if I do that?
Yeah, no problem at all. Go ahead and do that.
Great. So we have just hit 8 o'clock, and I don't want to keep people too long. So I just want to ask you one final question, and apologies to all the other people who have asked questions that we haven't had time for. But Jan asks, what is your story on the origin of the name of the Bateleur? I know there's many different theories, but do you have a favorite or a theory of the origin of the name?
As you say, there's several different theories. I like the notion that it's Bateleur is the French word for acrobat, because they are certainly very acrobatic, aerobatic in the air. They have these incredible displays. So I like to think that that's perhaps the origin of the name, but I really don't know. It could be several different sources. I just like the name Bateleur because it's unusual. It's different from all the other eagles, which are a something eagle or whatever.
Yeah,
Bateleur,
absolutely.
quite descriptive of. It's quite unique, quite different.
Yeah, I agree. I'm also a fan of the name, and I also like that origin story. So I hope it is true.
Yeah.
Okay, then I think we will leave it there, and apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to, but I would just like to say thank you to everyone for tuning in again to our first webinar of the year. And we're looking forward to many more exciting and interesting webinars. And finally, just to say thank you very much, Rick, for joining us and presenting on your experiences with raptor conservation around the world. It's been fascinating. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's been a great pleasure.
Great. Well, then, just a reminder to everyone to please do join us in 2 weeks' time for our World Wetlands Day webinar, and also donate to our webinars via Quicket, and to stand a chance of winning the amazing Ultimate Companion to Birding in Southern Africa, which was kindly donated by Peregrine. So with that, I will leave you all. Thank you very much, and good night.